Thank you, Jana, for the wonderful introduction. Um, the afternoon is going to be very dense. We decided to, instead of having an introduction, to have a quick conversation with Nick, who has been accompanying the work of Rebecca for many, many years, perhaps from the beginning. And
Not quite.
and so, first of all, thank you so much for your support from the very beginning of this enterprise. It's been extremely important and dear to us. And so perhaps we can really start from how you encountered the work of Rebecca and why did it stay with you for so long? You've been a champion of a practice now, throughout the years.
Actually, if I would just like to begin by, I will not be the last person who sits on this platform who wants to congratulate Jana in making an exhibition which shows us many new aspects of Rebecca's work, or brings some aspects with which we are quite familiar also into focus in a really interesting way. So thank you, Jana. I think I first became, it was a long time ago, but my recollection is that I first became engaged by the work of Rebecca because I was looking at the work of those artists in Europe and America who were working in performance and film in the late 60s and early 70s. Information about what they were doing was not so widely transmitted as would be the case. Was not so widely transmitted as would be the case today. And so the sources of information were principally from the magazines, including Artforum, especially. And occasionally there would be an opportunity to see a video or a film. And I was very interested by the early performance pieces of Rebecca, particularly those works in which, with the body extensions, she was working in the outdoors, in the films and the videos. And for me, this was a step beyond, for instance, what Franz Erhard Walter had been doing. It had a very interesting but different sensibility from what was happening in America with someone like Bruce Nauman. And there are some interesting points of comparison, but I think Rebecca's work was so distinctive because I could not imagine that it could have been made by a male artist. It was very much her working with the female body in a way that was completely distinctive. Of course, in the next stage, which you see in the first big room, then when she went to America and she started to make the films and doing also the performances on indoors, where the performances are also much more choreographed in a different way, which then leads on to the Eintanze. That was in a way a second moment when I became engaged in her work. I suppose the third moment was probably in the early 80s when I began to see the machines and began to understand that these were a surrogate for human behavior and a surrogate for human movement. And again, this work was really distinctive. But I didn't work with her at that time for a number of different reasons, but only later. And of course, when she was in America through the 70s, her work was much less visible here in Europe.
Thank you. And what was the first step? How did you begin working with Rebecca? How this observation, this critical observation, became a critical exchange, a proper exchange between the two of you?
But I think anyone who encountered Rebecca, it wasn't long before there was an encounter, literally. I mean, she enjoyed conversation. She enjoyed testing you. It was always, the relationship with Rebecca was always very much a one-to-one relationship. You know, it's almost as though when you were talking with her, she had blinkers on and she was entirely focused on you. In a way, that was very flattering. But it led to an intensity of conversation, which I think is rather rare. That's not to say she didn't speak on platforms and so on and so forth. Of course she did. But that, for me, that conversation really only began in the 80s, when I would perhaps visit an exhibition in a gallery and would be engaged by the machines, or probably from the mid-80s, when she started to work in a more expansive way with installations in specific places rather than in specific museums or galleries. That was a moment when everything, I mean, no doubt we'll be talking about this later today, but that was a moment when, of course, her world opened to an engagement, as Jana mentioned, with, and you mentioned also, with, you know, the bigger political issues of the day. But that's a long way down in the story. I mean, that's 20 years on from the 70s. This is in the early 90s.
And as we can learn from this exhibition and previous exhibition, Rebecca's work is in dialogue with different disciplines, and she was passionate for film, without doubt. She was an avid reader, for sure, so she had a very specific understanding of literature. This exhibition emphasizes a specific concern or preoccupation for choreography. What was in your, as you can recall, what were her main artistic preoccupations? Did they unfold throughout the years, or I'm going back to the dialogues you had with her. So what was the heart of her artistic concern? No?
I suppose, Andrea, that I think that, as we will discover, I think, in the course of today, the extraordinary thing about her work was the way in which it grew. I mean, she was never content to repeat herself, really. I mean, it was retained that sense of the very personal. But as I said a moment ago, it then began to address the wider issues of our place in the world, and then some of the more horrific and issues that have emerged in the history of the 20th century. But I think even when she was making these pieces that engaged with the history of Germany, whether it was the piece in Münster, where she took the former SS prison and opened it for the first time in 40 years, or Concert for Buchenwald in Weimar. Even when she was dealing with those, there was nevertheless a continuation of a kind of personal journey which she was exploring in more intimate works. So her concerns with the universe in its widest sense, her concerns with astrology, her concerns with, I mean, her continued commitment to literature and to poetry and her writing, which was extensive. I mean, I'm not saying anything very original. These things, as you yourself have said, these things come together in her work in a way that I don't recognize in any other artist. And indeed, very few artists are able to work in different mediums to such strong effect, I think, as Rebecca.
You've been, from the very beginning, mentioning her eccentric position. There was something different, there was something specific. You mentioned Franz Gerhard Walter. We actually had a show already created by Jana Baumann in the very same rooms. And Bruce Nauman had specific place in European art history. But what posture, what position do you think Rebecca inhabits in the art across the 20th and 21st century? Is it and what will be, perhaps we cannot say, and hopefully the symposium will be contributing, what will be the specific line that she will set within the field of art history?
But I think the first thing to say is I think she occupies a singular position. She's not part of it. Even now, with her death, we begin to see her as a historical figure in a different sense, but she wasn't clearly not part of a movement. She had very strong affinities with other artists, particularly, I think, those artists. Well, she had an affinity, I think, with those artists in Antipova and notably, of course, with Yanis Kounelis. And I think that the way those artists explored notions of installation and space were undoubtedly influential on her, as was Beuys. But the sensibility that she brought and this connection back to her own body and to the bodies of animals, birds in particular, the sensuality which is present in so much of her work is not something you find in another artist. And I think that today's symposium is in a way a beginning of unpacking some of the elements of her work. I mean, there've been, recently in the last 5 years, there've been 2 or 3 exhibitions that have looked at particular aspects in Basel, for instance, focusing on the body, and then the exhibition in Metz, which was relating back to her interest in Surrealism and Raymond Roussel and this kind of history. But I think the more we explore, the more we will find.
Definitely. And one area, one discipline that this exhibition perhaps unconsciously highlights that was really present in Basel is the relevance of sound. I would say music was a fundamental preoccupation for Rebecca, but in this show specifically, sound emerges as a fundamental component that is also talking to another idea of music, a more rhythmic structure avant-garde tradition of music. That's my impression, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, at the end of the 60s and in the early 70s, I can remember being very, there was a lot of attention, particularly in the mid-60s, to the notion of kinetic. But it was coming from a very different position. It was coming from the traditions and the principles of constructivism, and was an examination very often of issues to do with chance and also light. But Rebecca's kineticist works, once they began to develop, obviously had that choreographic quality, but she had this incredible ability to stretch time. I mean, there's no work in the show here that doesn't in some way create that tension as you begin to anticipate and sense what will happen with the movement of this kinetic object. But it's not predictable, and it's tense, and it ultimately can lead to a sense of almost ecstasy in the work, which again is not something that you find in the traditions of kinetic art, for instance.
One of the reasons why we are particularly proud with this exhibition is that it becomes a sort of organic body, but it's not a mechanical body, because as you exactly said, it's not, you cannot foresee what's happening and when and where, and that makes it an organism. So perhaps the last question will be how, but please go.
No, I mean, I just think that you talk about that movement, and I was talking about the kinetic. The interesting thing is, in a way, how the means by which she achieves that, which is obviously so beautifully, technically achieved, because that sense of the motors and the sense of machinery, even though we keep calling them machines, actually slips away. And so you're left with a kind of essence in each case, rather than being simply astonished by the quality, the smoothness, and the inevitability in some ways of the movement.
Yes, thank you for precising. It's a wonderful note. I think we could continue our conversation for a long time. I'm sure the audience is mesmerized by your words. Perhaps the last question could be how this exhibition has, and if this exhibition has changed the reading of Rebecca's practice, your reading of Rebecca's practice.
Well, I was very grateful to Jana for having discovered some films, or being able to present some films which I could not remember, or at least I don't think sometimes I have even ever seen. So for this to be, in a way, the foundation for the exhibition, and the way in which it's presented in this space, I think that was to put the emphasis there, and then to begin to explore how that connects out into much more recent work. That was probably the most interesting, for me, revelation within the show.
So much. I think it's time to hand over to Hendrik Folkert, who is coordinating the next, the first, in fact, panel discussion, but not before thanking again Nick Serota for his wonderful contribution.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.